You're watching Middle East Now on I24 News. I'm Laura Cellier, and these are the headlines.
A rapid turn of events in Syria. Opposition forces are advancing. Israel says it is monitoring the situation. A Hamas delegation in Cairo for hostage talks, but Israeli officials say nothing has changed. And France accuses Israel of violating the terms of a ceasefire with the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah.
Welcome. Well, we begin with a fast-moving situation in Syria. Russian warplanes have been bombing the towns of Hama and other parts of the Idlib region in a bid to stop the advance of Syrian opposition forces. The rebels staged a stunning advance over the weekend, taking the city of Aleppo and much of the surrounding countryside. Hundreds of Syrian troops and some civilians were killed in the offensive, which has the backing of Turkey and which is being led by jihadist elements such as the HTS group, formerly known as the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Nusra Front. Well, that's fueling concerns for Kurds, Christians and other minorities. And in the last hour, these pictures emerged. The Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, who had been in Moscow, meeting with Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, in Damascus. Well, the United States, which has in the past supported rebel forces, says it has nothing to do with this latest advance. Our Middle East correspondent, Aaron Ossaran, breaks it down for us.
Islamist rebels continue to advance in western Syria after sweeping through Aleppo, the country's second largest city. It took Syrian President Bashar al-Assad 4 years to capture Aleppo in the civil war. The rebels took it back within hours.
الله أكبر أرتال الثوار تدخل مدينة حلب بالمئات الله أكبر.
After seizing most of the city with little to no resistance from government troops, rebel forces toppled the statue of Assad's brother Basil in scenes reminiscent of last decade's Arab Spring. Rebel forces then continued south, gaining control over dozens of towns and villages on their way to the city of Hama. After seizing the Aleppo International Airport, insurgents led by Hayat Tahrir al-Shem, a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, took over the Queiris military airport, along with all its fighter jets, weapons, and ammunition. After absorbing the initial shock of the surprise offensive, regime forces appear to have regrouped and are repelling rebel advances in Hama province. In phone calls with Arab leaders, President Assad said Syria will defend its stability and territorial integrity against terrorists and their supporters. Iran and Russia vowed to continue supporting Assad as Russian jets bombarded civilian areas of Idlib and Aleppo.
We see that after the ceasefire between Lebanon and the Zionist regime, terrorist groups in Syria have tried to take advantage of the situation. God willing, the resistance front and the Syrian government will be victorious, and they will not be able to achieve their goals.
With the initial momentum of the rebels largely halted, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq have begun flowing into Syria to help defend Assad's hold, in what seems to be a long-awaited restart of the Syrian civil war.
Well, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his government is watching closely what is happening across the border. Well, with me in the studio this hour, Neri Zilber is a journalist and adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thanks very much for being with us, Neri. So clearly, Israel's decapitation of Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terrorist group in Lebanon, is producing some unintended consequences in that it has emboldened the opposition forces in Syria.
It seems that way, although we shouldn't draw too direct a link between what happened in Lebanon and what's happening in Syria. The rebels and jihadists in Syria make their own calculations, and they've probably been preparing this offensive for quite some time, just based on its wild success over the past, 4 days. We should be mindful, though. It's very telling that the Iranian foreign minister felt the need to fly into Damascus to meet with Syrian dictator / President Bashar al-Assad. The Iranian foreign minister flew into Beirut almost exactly a week ago to negotiate the ceasefire between another Iranian patron, Hezbollah, and Israel. Another surrender potentially in the offing with regard to Syria, comparable to what happened in Lebanon last week. Not a very good week at all for the Iranian-led axis. We're seeing the results now on the battlefield of Syria.
It could be a pretty good week, though, for Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who does support many of these forces in Syria.
He does, but to the best of our understanding, it's not his rebel groups inside Syria that are actually launching this offensive, although they may have joined in the fray. But yes, undoubtedly, Turkey is looking at this and acting inside Syria for its own interests. Israel, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister here, Benjamin Netanyahu, said Israel is observing but not getting involved. And I was told earlier today that Israel is taking a wait-and-see approach and is not going to tip the scales one way or the other. There is an opportunity here for Israel if Assad goes down vis-a-vis the overall Iranian axis, but allowing jihadists to take control of a Middle Eastern country, not great for Israel either.
Yeah, there's that old adage, my enemy's enemy, not necessarily my friend, isn't there? All right, Neri, for now. Thank you very much. Well, let's take a closer look at some of the various actors in the renewed fighting in Syria. Take a look.
Thousands of Syrian rebels have captured Aleppo and continue to advance. At the forefront of the offensive is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, the most powerful jihadist faction in northwest Syria. Originally an offshoot of al-Qaeda, it has evolved into a dominant force, largely controlling the Idlib province and surrounding areas. But HTS might now be facing a setback, as reports circulating on Sunday say that the organization's leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, may have been killed in a Russian airstrike. Another key player is the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, or SNA. What started as a coalition of rebel groups is now a formidable faction that operates in close coordination with Turkey. The SNA's leadership is less centralized than the HTS. Leading the Sultan division is Ahmed Othman, and leading the Syrian Liberation Front is Faraz al-Bayoush. While the faction has a degree of autonomy, Turkish commanders are key to the coordination and strategy of large-scale operations in northern Syria. Multiple factions of Kurdish forces control vast swaths of Syria, some of which have come into direct conflict with the advancing rebel forces. Groups like Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, and the National Front for Liberation are all fighting alongside the HTS and the SNA. While these factions have differing ideologies, they have formed temporary alliances in the face of a common enemy, the Assad regime and its backers in Moscow and Tehran.
All right, well, to talk more about what is happening in Syria, we're joined now by Omar Abu Layla. He's the Executive Director of Deir ez-Zor 24. Welcome to you, Omar. We're also joined by Giran Ozkan. He's the Executive Director of the Kurdish Peace Institute. Welcome to you, Giran, as well. So, Omar, I'll start with you. No one is disputing that Syrians have suffered greatly under the dictator Bashar al-Assad for many years, but many are asking whether we should be cheering on the rebels when there are clearly Islamist, jihadist elements among them. Can you talk us through that?
Thank you so much, Laura, for having me again. It's not necessary the Syrian shows support for these groups, including like Islamic groups or other groups, more than they feel like we give up after 13 years. And although we're just watching what's going on the ground in Syria, Bashar al-Assad in the last years and months got more support, internationally support, and trying to show that I am the real president of this country. So this operation happened in a time the people, the Syrians, has no decision to stop it or not, more than like we need any faction, any group on the ground to kick this regime away of our towns, which occupied by the Iranian-backed militia, by Hezbollah, by the IRGC, and by the Assad regime. And this is what happened in the past 2-3 days. Like millions of the Syrians inside Idlib and the countryside of Aleppo returning soon to their towns after this, what happened in Aleppo. So the people saying like, it's not a matter of 3 weeks, 3 months, or 3 years, it's 13 years. And we were waiting to kick this regime away, and at least we back to our towns and villages.
Okay, Omar, thank you. Giran, let me bring you in because we are getting reports that the Islamists and the Kurdish forces are coming into conflict in some areas. We've got some pretty distressing footage going around on social media, no way of verifying it, of some of these Islamists taking Kurdish female fighters hostage. Are you worried about the fate of the Kurds in Syria?
Hi, Laura. Yes, very worried. Right now, as you quite rightly mentioned, the footage coming out is very depressing and concerning because on the one side, we have a Syrian regime who has killed hundreds of thousands, and yet on the other side, we have Islamist jihadist forces that are willing to do the same thing to people that don't agree with them. So, you know, the international community needs to rid itself of this approach whereby they have to pick a lesser of two evils, because both are evil in their approach to the whole crisis in the country. And the Kurds find themselves now fighting on multiple fronts because they suffer from the Syrian regime, they suffer from the Islamists that are spreading across northwestern Syria right now, and they suffer from the Turkish state's ambitions, who, as you said in your report, are the underwriters of this latest offensive. So the videos and the messaging that's coming out of northwest Syria right now, and in Aleppo specifically, where there is a sizable Kurdish population, and also the small town of Tel Rifat that has now been encircled by these jihadist forces backed by Turkey. The Kurds are bracing for a humanitarian catastrophe any moment.
Omar, how would you respond to that? The Kurds are bracing for a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, are the Kurds, are other minorities like Christians safe in Syria as these opposition forces advance?
Let's be a bit fair, to be honest with you. I'm not here supporting any group in Syria, in northeast or northwest or in anywhere, more than to support civilians and protect them. So they do have the right that to protect their population, people in the countryside of Aleppo or in anywhere, absolutely. But at the same time, I just saw an official statement from these Syrian opposition factions. They offered the SDF to withdraw from the countryside of Aleppo to Raqqa and northeast Syria, and their right is the same right to others, as they mentioned today also in a footage with the Christian people inside Aleppo and other. So they have something, I do believe this is a pressure and this is something pushed by Turkey on these groups, that you must be fair with all the people in Aleppo, in the countryside of Aleppo or Idlib also. But it doesn't mean that there is no violation. Absolutely, we have witnessed many violations in the past years from these groups, especially from the national army or the faction support directly by Turkey. Also, we did not witness a lot of conflict between Hayat Tahrir Sham and the SDF in the past years. So the most tension between these groups, it's between the SDF and between the national army, which is supported by Turkey. And hopefully this time it's something different, because I see they are focusing on the main enemy, which is Bashar al-Assad and the Iranian-backed militia, more than to get in conflict. It happened somehow in the past hours in Tel Rifat and some other towns. But at the same time, they offered them that you withdraw with your weapons, with your tanks, safely to northeast Syria. No one will stop you. At the same time, we have to finish our battle against Assad regime.
All right, thank you, Omar. Giran, your response to that, and what are the Kurds planning going forward? I mean, is there an expectation that this could be a long, prolonged, drawn-out conflict? There is something of a power vacuum in Syria right now. And what about the United States? We've had a kind of ambiguous statement with the US saying that they're not involved in the current situation. Are you concerned that the US might withdraw support for the Kurds, as President Trump did during his first term?
Laura, I believe Omar is referencing a statement that was released by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the former affiliate, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And so I don't know how much we can believe a statement made by an organization that has in its past, and up until very recently in the places that it's controlling, has abused human rights all over the place, has beheaded Kurdish civilians in front of camera. So I don't know how much we can take that statement seriously at this point. But it also does say one thing, that an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the country is actually behaving more pragmatically than Turkish-backed organizations and Turkish-backed jihadists who are attacking Kurdish towns right now. That is a worrying development and shows that Turkey's priority is not so much regime change, it's not so much pushing back against Assad or liberating areas in Syria. It is predominantly their primary objective is to push back against the Kurds, is to diminish any kind of Kurdish political articulation in the region. And our past experience, the Kurdish people's past experience in Syria, shows that they can't trust any jihadist organization that claims that they will respect their dignity and human rights. We've seen in places like Afrin, in places like Tel Abyad, where Turkish-backed forces have tortured, murdered, and raped Kurdish civilians. So that, to me, at this point, it's too early to say, but coming to your second question, yes, the US's position is going to be very important. As of yet, they made a very late statement, relatively speaking, to where these developments exploded about 4 days ago, and we only just got a statement from the National Security Council here in the US. The northwest of Syria isn't a place in which the Americans are present. And I believe, strategically speaking for them, they haven't prioritized this part of Syria. And I don't expect much to be done there on behalf of the Americans. But I would add here that a fundamentalist conflict in this part of the country where Sunni jihadists are pushing back against Assad will bring in more Iranian proxies and Iranian military personnel themselves, and will turn the country into a more unstable part for the whole region, and especially Israel and the West.
All right, Giran, thank you very much. Omar, I'll bring you back in. I mean, it doesn't look as though Bashar al-Assad is going to go quietly. He's meeting right now with the Iranian foreign minister in Damascus. I mean, given the brutal tactics that we've seen from his regime, coupled with the Russian Air Force and the Iranian proxy militias, are you concerned that there could be a very swift retribution for what's happened over the past few days?
I think the area that Bashar al-Assad and its force with the Iranian-backed militia, they lost in the past 3 days or 4 days, they cannot get it back easily. Because if you look to the factions, how much weapons they controlled and got in Aleppo, in the countryside of Idlib, and even around Hama, it shows you exactly this military operation is a huge military operation. Even Bashar al-Assad cannot handle it, because the Syrian army or Bashar al-Assad's force were mostly in the past years relying on the Russian air covers more in these battles, but this time they were alone. That's why you saw how these factions quickly they controlled one of the hugest provinces in Syria, like Aleppo. So I don't expect a lot, whatever. They are gonna to launch absolutely massive airstrikes against civilians in these cities. We expect the scenario, but at the same time, I do believe they cannot get back what they lost.
All right. Omar Abu Layla, Giran Ozkan, thank you very much indeed to you both.
Thank you so much.
Well, the United Arab Emirates was one of the first countries to come out with a public message of support for Syria's beleaguered President Assad. So why is the UAE such a staunch supporter of the regime in Damascus? Let's go to Dubai. We're joined by our correspondent, Bastien Bourri. So, Bastien, first of all, why does the UAE have an interest in what's happening in Syria?
Well, let's say it's the umpteenth step in the return of Syria to the international scene as a result, actually, of efforts from the Gulf itself. It began in 2018 when the UAE reopened its embassy in Damascus. Bashar al-Assad had paid in return in 2022 his first visit to an Arab country since the beginning of the Syrian war. Then there was this earthquake in 2023, tragic event for the populations, but also an opportunity that the Assad regime took to draw attention as well as humanitarian aid, especially from countries of the Arab League, like the UAE, who had excluded Syria a few years earlier. That said, Syria is no longer considered a priority for the UE. Adjusting to the challenges of the wars in Gaza and Ukraine has become the main task for the Gulf countries, who do not consider the spread of armed groups and terrorism in Syria, in addition to the increasing influence of Iran there, as a major threat anymore.
So why have the Emiratis come out in support of Assad, and what about the Saudis? Are they pretty much of the same mind?
Well, today the Emiratis want some sort of political and economic unity around Syria, first by getting closer to Russia and Turkey, whose foothold, as you know, there has increased considerably, notably since their military operations in northern Syria, and second by betting on the fact, that Syria is a large market with economic opportunities thanks to its strategic position between the east and the west. And all this is also beneficial for Syria itself because it acknowledges the sort of comeback of the Assad government into regional and international politics. And as a matter of fact, the Americans know they are powerless in the face of these new dynamics from which they have disengaged themselves. So knowing that they will not be targeted by American sanctions, the Emiratis are pretty much hands-free. And the Saudis also want to weaken the Iranian influence in Syria, which is known to be considerable. So Riyadh and other Arab countries are going to put forward tens of billions of dollars for Damascus in the coming months and years for the reconstruction of Syria, its developments, the reopening of its economy, its tourism, etc. However, Riyadh's expectations for reforms in Syria and for some sort of reduction of Tehran's influence there are perhaps too ambitious, because Saudi Arabia's leverage on Syria outside of money remains pretty minimal.
Bastien, thank you very much. Bastien Pori there in Dubai. Well, the United States says that Syria's president lost control of Aleppo because of his over-reliance on Russia and Iran. This and his refusal to take part in the peace process that was set out by the UN Security Council a few years ago. Well, for more on the US position on Syria, we're joined by Norman Rule. He's a former senior US intelligence official and senior advisor at the group United Against a Nuclear Iran. Good to have you with us, Norman. Thank you for joining us. So there does seem to be both an upside and a downside for the US. Iran is seeing its grip on Syria weakened, perhaps, but Islamists and jihadists appear to be on the rise. How should the US navigate this?
Good evening. The United States has few equities in Syria, but they are important. First and foremost, the protection of our forces in Syrian territory who are there to prevent the reestablishment of ISIS. This has been a year that has seen ISIS expand its reach within Syria and shows significant signs of reemerging as a regional threat. So that is something Washington is going to want to watch. Secondly, if Iran can be neutralized in Syria or its capacity significantly reduced, this will be significantly helpful for the stability of Lebanon, the safety of Israel, and also reducing Iran's regional influence and the reputation of the Quds Force. Last, there's going to be some discussion in Washington between the role of Turkey. I don't think it's a surprise that Washington doesn't want to put boots on the ground in Syria, and someone's got to take this on. But the idea of excessive Turkish influence in Syria does make some wary in Washington.
Why did it take the US to take so long to come out with a statement?
I don't think Washington has much time or interest in Syrian events, and there was probably a hope in Washington, as well as in other countries, that the ongoing stalemate would continue. The movement by the rebels not only likely surprised the rebels, but took a number of governments unaware.
Will the Americans stand by their Kurdish allies, the allies who defeated ISIS in the past? We know that President Trump withdrew troops and withdrew support for the Kurds. Do you think that that will be the policy going forward?
The Biden administration will certainly continue to maintain that relationship. It is true that President Trump, on perhaps 2 occasions, attempted to reduce U.S. forces or remove U.S. forces from Syria, but was convinced otherwise by his staffers. It really comes down to what is the role of those troops in preventing a threat against the United States directly, the role of ISIS. And that discussion has yet to take place, obviously, among Trump's advisors.
Norman Rule, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Neri Silva's with me in the studio. So, I mean, a hugely complex situation in Syria. Multiple players, who will come out on top. Will it be Turkey? Will it be the Islamists? Or does this have the potential to weaken the resistance led by Iran? I mean, where do you see this going?
Look, number one, nobody knows, because a week ago exactly, nobody could have predicted this offensive by the Syrian rebels and the successful of an offensive by the Syrian rebels. Everyone a week ago was looking at ways to bring Syria back into the fold. Perhaps there was a deal to be had with the Assad regime and the Russians to stabilize Lebanon vis-a-vis Israel's equities in Syria. So again, we have to show a bit of humility in terms of projecting forward. I think the reality moving forward will be dictated by what happens on the ground. If the rebels can actually bring the fight to Damascus and really shake the Assad regime grip over the country, that will be an earthquake in Middle Eastern terms. It would also bring down Russian and Iranian influence really in the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean. That will also have knock-on effects, not only for Israel, but also for U.S. policy in the region. And then obviously, as Norman mentioned, we'll have a new U.S. president in less than 2 months. He will also have very significant ideas, shall we say, about what he wants to do and what he doesn't want to do in the Middle East. So again, we have to wait and see what happens. But again, Syria shouldn't be understated in terms of its centrality in Middle Eastern security and stability and geopolitics as well.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainties. Thank you, Neri, for now. Neri Silva, he's staying with us after the break. When we come back, a Hamas delegation is in Cairo, but Israel says nothing has changed when it comes to a potential hostage deal. This is Egypt and Israel are reportedly holding talks on Israel withdrawing from the Rafah crossing. We'll talk more about that after the break. Stay tuned.
You live in Israel or you are preparing for your Aliyah? Congratulations. You have a smartphone? Perfect. Download the Olim app for free and discover everything we have to offer. Booking medical and administrative appointments, bills paying, debt verification, instant translation, contractor recommendation, request tracking, and much more. And if you can't manage it on your own, our team speaks your language and assists you with all your procedures in Israel, starting from 199 shekels per month, unlimited and for the whole family. Don't hesitate any longer. Download the app or contact us.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back. Israel's President Herzog has been meeting with the family of American-Israeli hostage Edan Alexander, who was seen in a hostage video that was released yesterday. Meanwhile, a Hamas delegation is in Cairo for talks, but Israeli officials are warning that nothing has changed when it comes to the group's position. And inside Gaza, terrorist groups continue to loot aid trucks that are meant for civilians. Our Bianca Zanini reports.
קוראים לי עידן אלכסנדר, ואני אסיר בשבי החמאס יותר מ-420. אבא, אני קרוי, סבא סבתא. כל יום שעובר, הכאב מבפנים גודל. אני מתגעגע אליכם מאוד. כל יום. אני מתפלל שאני לא אתכם שוב בקרוב. בבקשה, תשארו חזקים. זה רק עניין של זמן.
Hamas released a new video on Saturday showing 20-year-old American-Israeli hostage Edan Alexander, still being held in Gaza, calling on the Israeli and American governments to secure his release and bring him home. Saturday night, thousands of Israelis took to the street once again, calling for a ceasefire, calling for the hostages to come home. Edan's mother spoke to the crowds with a message.
So I turn to you, Prime Minister, in my name, in the name of my family, and in the name of the Israeli people. And I want you to keep your promise to me, because all eyes are on you now, waiting for you to make a courageous decision.
Sunday morning, Israeli President Isaac Herzog met with Edan's mother and stressed the immediate need to bring them all home.
The time is now. We want everyone home urgently. Now is the time to act. There are negotiations taking place behind the scenes, and it can be done. Now is the opportunity to bring about a meaningful change that will lead to a deal to free the hostages.
Meanwhile, in Gaza, the fighting continues. The IDF says it killed a member of the World Central Kitchen Organization who participated in the October 7th massacre in Israel in a strike in the southern city of Khan Yunis on Saturday. The organization released a statement saying it has paused its operations in Gaza. The international aid agency Save the Children also said one of its staff members was killed in a strike. According to the Hamas-run health ministry, at least 25 Palestinians were killed by Israeli military strikes across Gaza overnight and Saturday. In the latest push for a U.S.-brokered ceasefire for hostages deal and to carve out a plan for the day after in Gaza, Hamas representatives arrived in Cairo Saturday for talks with Egyptian negotiators. In an interview with Israeli Army Radio Sunday morning, far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir in Israel repeated that he opposes a deal in a thinly veiled threat that his party would leave the government if it happens. Ben-Gvir also reiterated his support for settlements in Gaza, adding that the only times Israel defeated its enemies were when it took territory from them. And he added he wants to encourage immigration of Palestinians from Gaza. Despite Israel reaching a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon a few days ago, a similar deal in Gaza seems as far away as ever.
Well, let's get the latest. Our correspondent Zach Anders is down close to the border with Gaza. So, Zach, Hamas delegation in Cairo, that is raising hopes of a ceasefire and hostage deal, but Israel is saying not so fast. What do we know so far?
Yeah, you know, there's some interesting movement, at least some interesting statements that have been made now. What Hamas is saying, they're telling the French news agency AFP that they're ready for a deal, but, quote, have not received any new offer or proposal so far, and that they're welcome to all ideas and proposals. On the Israeli side, we're hearing a muted reaction that there are still some hard lines that they're not entirely sure Hamas is willing to walk back from, keeping troops inside the Gaza Strip, however that looks like, and a complete cessation of all hostilities, with the IDF, Israel still reaffirming that this is going to end one way or another with the complete destruction of Hamas, and that any ceasefire is only a temporary stop to that ultimate war aim. Of course, 400 plus days we've got these hostages hidden somewhere in that darkness behind me. What's remarkable is in the north of the Gaza Strip this afternoon, we've been seeing flares, we've been hearing gunfire. This is the heaviest concentration of fighting inside the Gaza Strip in the north, near Jabalia, that refugee camp, or at least it was prior to October 7th. And that fighting has ended up being some of the highest concentration of IDF fatalities over the last 2 months is in that area. More than 24 Israeli soldiers, scores have been wounded, let alone those 24 who have been killed in the fighting in and around this area. And I need to stress that this is a wrecked, ruined area, and the fighting that is taking place is within the rubble. Now, what we've had a couple of high-level conversations with senior IDF officials about what this looks like on the ground. They're telling us that these are small pockets, small bands of Hamas men who are working decentralized guerrilla fighting without real firm leadership, but they still have the weapons and the ammunition to keep going. Civilians in this area, a lot of them recognizing the danger, have fled, but there are still civilians, we're told, in and around this area, albeit not at every pinpoint corner where some of this fighting has been the most intense. As for, again, I'll circle back to that potential, or at least the talk on regarding a hostage deal. Last night in Tel Aviv, the mother of Avidan Alexander saying that she had a phone call after the video was released from Prime Minister Netanyahu. She told the Prime Minister, she says that that he is crying, she's crying out for a rescue. The Prime Minister reportedly telling her, she says at that rally last night, that the conditions are right for a deal and that they're working towards a deal. Laura?
All right. Zach, thank you very much. Zach Andrews there down at the border with Gaza. Well, Neri Zilba is with me in the studio. He's a journalist and host of the podcast Israel Policy Pod. Thanks for staying with us, Neri. So I think it's the 4th or the 5th time that the IDF have had to go into this Jabalia district of northern Gaza. Are we nearing an end game here when it comes to fighting Hamas, or is this just a case of whack-a-mole? You hit one and two more appear in its place?
It depends who you ask. It depends who inside the Israeli government and inside the Israeli military you ask. From my information, the Jabalia operation, it's a refugee camp in northern Gaza. Really the heart of Hamas's resistance or continued resistance in northern Gaza is in Jabalia. The IDF says it'll take a few more weeks. We have to keep in mind this is an operation that's already been going on for 2 months, nearly 2 months. Very high IDF death toll in this one operation. So not minor resistance, not minor fighting going on there, as Zach alluded to in his report. And again, the question really on everyone's minds, what's the end game? You call it whack-a-mole. There are some inside the Israeli government who say we're going to continue until total victory, until Hamas is completely eliminated. I don't quite know what that looks like in military terms. It's very clear that Israel is not moving towards that in governance and civil terms because it hasn't presented an alternative to Hamas rule. That's been a problem as well. And then on top of that, obviously, the remaining 101 hostages, Israelis and foreign nationals, we have to keep in mind, not just
Americans,
Israelis.
like Aidan Alexander?
Right, dual nationals like Aidan Alexander, but also foreign nationals, which you never hear about as well, not just Israelis there. What does that
British
do?
citizen, Emily Damari is one of them?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, a lot of people are... Sorry, finish your point.
No, I was going to say, how does that play into the goal of eliminating and destroying Hamas completely? How do you actually cut a deal? Under what terms? To get those people out of Hamas. Right,
because a lot of people are asking, well, hang on a minute, how was Israel able to sign a deal with Hezbollah and stop fighting there, and they're not holding any hostages, and it can't do something else with Hamas?
Yes, that is a key question.
Because they're saying they won't be able to go back. Netanyahu says we won't be able to go back into Gaza.
Right, although he said a few days ago that he will go right back into Lebanon if there's a violation of that ceasefire.
Right.
So why can you go back into Lebanon and not Gaza? Obviously, Gaza would be much easier to resume fighting in, given the security reality in Gaza vis-a-vis Lebanon. If you want my honest opinion, it's politics. It's much easier for Netanyahu to cut a deal for a ceasefire in Lebanon versus cutting a deal for a ceasefire in Gaza. He knows that his far-right coalition allies, as Itamar Ben-Gvir even said today, will threaten and probably pull the trigger on collapsing his government if he actually stops the fighting in Gaza to get those hostages out. It's a major, major political conundrum for Netanyahu. For the better part of a year, he's chosen the safety and security of his governing coalition over the safety and security of the remaining hostages, sadly.
All right, Neri, thank you. Well, with a Hamas delegation in Cairo, there are also reports in Arab media that Egypt is in talks with Israel to reopen the Rafah border crossing with Gaza. That would enable more aid to get through to civilians in Gaza and could pave the way for a broader peace deal. For more on that, we're joined by Hossein Kamel Haredi. He's the former assistant to the Egyptian foreign minister and the former director of the Department of Israeli Affairs at the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. Good evening to you, sir. Good to have you with us. So can you confirm for us then, are these talks going on between Egypt and Israel on the Rafah crossing? And what would Israel get in return if it was to relinquish control?
Well, from an Egyptian point of view, what we are trying to do right now is just to get all the parties concerned, the Israelis, the Hamas people, the Palestinians in the Palestinian National Authority, to agree on a package deal, not only concerning a ceasefire in Gaza, but also the post-war situation in Gaza, and who would run Gaza afterwards. And in this context, of course, the question of the Rafah crossing is really very important. So what we are trying to do now is to push the Israelis, the Palestinians, including Hamas people, to agree on a package that would serve the interests of them all.
And do you think that a deal is possible then? Are you hopeful that a deal can be reached?
Well, I guess so, but the question is the timing. When will Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ruling coalition in Israel would agree to such a package? Maybe not now. Maybe once President-elect Donald Trump would be at the Oval Office, maybe then the Israelis would announce their agreement to this package deal, madam.
Now, when it comes to the Rafah crossing, it has been problematic in the past, to say the least. How would Egypt prevent Hamas or other terrorist groups from restocking and rearming via Rafah and ensuring that we're back in the same situation a few years down the road?
No, we doubt very much if in the future, once the Israeli government would accept a ceasefire deal and would accept this principle of letting the Palestinians run Gaza Strip, we doubt very much if we'll go to the situation prior to October 7th, 2023. And I would go as far as saying that no similar attacks would take place once this package deal is in place and once there is an irreversible path towards a state of Palestine. We doubt very much in Cairo that the Palestinians would really be interested in mounting a similar attack. Having said that, I guess as far as the Rafah crossing is concerned, we understand that the Israeli Prime Minister previously said that he is open to withdraw Israeli forces from the Rafah crossing in stages. So we are working on that. We are working on that, and we'll see what kind of arrangement we reach with the Israelis. It all depends on the flexibility that the Israeli government would show. We understand that the Israeli military 1 month ago or 1.5 months ago said that there is no problem from a security point of view to withdraw from the Rafah area and the Rafah crossing. But for political reasons, domestic political reasons in Israel, at least publicly, the Israeli government and the Israeli prime minister are not interested in.
Sorry to interrupt you. What about the Palestinian politics then? Because I mean, we heard Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, lamenting the death of Sinwar and saying that he had been good for the Palestinian people. I mean, polls show that most Palestinians support what happened on October 7th. What is to say that they wouldn't try to do that again? What assurances does Cairo have?
No, it's not a question of assurances, madam. And I don't want to go back to what happened on October 7th and the background, the political background, the humanitarian background of the situation in the Gaza Strip before October 7th. It would lead us nowhere. It would lead us nowhere. So let's put this aside. What we can say from an Egyptian point of view, once Israel would show flexibility, once Israel would commit, once the Israeli prime minister and the ruling coalition in Israel would commit to a permanent ceasefire and to a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, I am sure that the Palestinians will be on board. And I doubt very much if any Palestinian, even those who support Hamas, would ever accept to relive the situation that has prevailed in Gaza Strip from October 7th still today.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Kamel Haredi. Good to talk to you.
It's my pleasure, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. Neri Zilba still with me in the studio. I mean, from the Egyptian point of view, it seems as though Israel is the obstacle and Israel must make more concessions.
Look, there's something to what he's saying. Obviously, it takes two to tango, and various sides, not only, by the way, Israel and Gaza-based Palestinians, but also Israel vis-a-vis the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority. With regard to the Rafah crossing in particular, to the best of my information, the real stumbling block isn't whether the IDF has a phased withdrawal and the negotiations in Cairo. The real stumbling block is this Israeli government does not want to allow the Palestinian Authority and its people to deploy publicly in the Rafah crossing. Netanyahu, as well as other senior ministers.
Because Hamas have signaled that they might be willing, they might be open to that.
Yeah, I think Hamas is not really in play. Nobody's negotiating for Hamas to retake control of the Rafah crossing. It's a question of which Palestinians in Gaza and maybe from outside of Gaza are brought in.
But do you think Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority would be able to prevent terrorist elements from rising again?
I think if done correctly, and again, we're just talking about the Rafah crossing, we're not thinking that the PA security forces will ride in tomorrow and retake control of Gaza, but just with regard to the Rafah crossing and getting it reopened and getting potentially more aid into Gaza, the big stumbling block is the fact that this Israeli government doesn't want the PA in uniform publicly to go and assert itself in Rafah or any other part of Gaza. And again, it's a political decision on the part of the Israeli government. It can be quibbled with. Obviously, there's still a Palestinian Authority very publicly in control of large pockets of the West Bank that coordinates every day and every night with Israel and the Israeli army, the Israeli intelligence services on security. The question on many people's minds is why is that okay for the West Bank, given the real security risks in the West Bank, and not for a border crossing in the Gaza Strip?
All right, Neri Zilba, thank you very much indeed. We appreciate it. Well, France has reportedly criticised Israel for violating a ceasefire with the Lebanese terrorist organisation Hezbollah. The truce has been holding, but Israel has carried out several strikes against Hezbollah, this in line with American guarantees which allow for Israel's right to defend itself. France has neither confirmed nor denied those reports. Our Robert Swift has more.
For now, 5 days in, the ceasefire on the Lebanon-Israel border is holding, bringing respite and a sense of normalcy to civilians in both nations, even as fighting goes on elsewhere in the region.
I welcome the ceasefire in Lebanon, and I hope it will be respected by all parties. My hope is that this opening for peace can bring a ceasefire on all fronts, especially Gaza.
Israel and Lebanon are accusing each other of breaking the ceasefire. France, One of the accord's brokers warns that 52 alleged Israeli violations risk reigniting the fighting. The IDF says that its activity in Lebanon in recent days, including an airstrike, were to enforce the ceasefire. Many of the million-plus Lebanese displaced by the war are returning home.
I wish for the best for the country. God willing, Lebanon will come back better than it was, just as Syed Hassan Nasrallah promised us. God willing, Lebanon will be rebuilt better than it was before.
For the tens of thousands of northern Israelis forced from their homes, many are reluctant to believe the peace will hold. But others are returning to the border to see for themselves what 14 months of warfare wrought.
I see that the first line of the houses is ruined completely. It was maybe a post of the Hezbollah, and we'll see what happens in the near future.
How much longer the sense of normalcy lasts remains to be seen.
Well, a new US envoy has been sent to help monitor the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Jasper Jeffers served in Iraq and Afghanistan and will work alongside the better-known diplomatic envoy, I think it's fair to say, Amos Hochstein. And some news in that incoming President Trump has announced that Massad Boulos will be a senior advisor on Arab and Middle East affairs. He is Lebanese and his son is married to one of Trump's daughters. Well, to talk about all of that, we're joined by Colonel Rich Alderson. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a geopolitical consultant at Dragoman LLC. Thanks for being with us, Rich. And first of all, are you familiar with General Jeffers, and are you confident that the ceasefire will hold?
Good to be with you. Two very different questions, because predicting that ceasefires will hold in the Middle East is always sort of a tenuous proposition. But Jasper Jeffers is an excellent officer. He's got a special operations background. Currently, he's sort of dual-hatted. He's the commander of SOC CENT, the Special Operations Command for the U.S. CENTCOM. Of course, he does have combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's worked with the Ranger Regiment and mechanized divisions in the U.S. Army, so he understands conventional warfare as well as counterterrorism. I think he's an excellent choice. Now, the key thing here is that military guys can observe the military technical aspects of cessation of hostilities, which is what this is about, but they really need to get a very skilled civilian counterpart into them. Now, as you said, Amos Hochstein is going to be, at least for now, the civilian counterpart. But they need to get somebody who's going to be focused on that task as well. Amos presumably will not stay in position past the end of the Biden administration. So we'll need to see who the other face is. Now, as to whether that means it holds, I think, look, whether we have good people monitoring or not is not what's going to determine whether the ceasefire cessation of hostility holds. It's how long do both sides, both Israel and Lebanon, or really Hezbollah in this case, do they see it in their interests to have it hold? And I think right now with Syria crumbling, and that's an important jewel in the Iranian and Hezbollah crown, they want no part of renewed fighting in southern Lebanon right now. So I'm fairly certain, at least for the midterm and short term, that this is going to hold.
Any view on incoming advisor on Arab and Middle East affairs, Massad Boulos? I mean, this was expected, wasn't it? Mr. Boulos helped Trump win over a lot of the Arab American voters in the run-up to the election.
Right. So very impressive guy. And like a lot of people in the Trump circle, has either personal or business ties with Trump. Look, he's already got the Trump has already announced as well that Steve Witkoff is going to be his envoy for the Middle East. He's also going to have people that he trusts that are going to be in the State Department and NSC working in the Middle East. So the U.S. Middle East policy is going to be the work of many hands. I think that Boulos is going to be a good influence there because he understands, certainly from the domestic perspective and the regional perspective as well, how the impact of U.S. action and inaction. He's going to be a voice, in my view, calling for strong U.S. leadership, something more assertive than what we've seen. But I don't know that he's going to be the point man per se. We still have a lot to go to see. Does, for instance, Secretary-designate Rubio, does he get approved? Who's his Middle East right hand? Who's going to be the senior director for the Middle East of the National Security Council? Boulos is a good, strong addition to the team, may not be the determinative single voice in where Trump goes on Mideast issues.
Of course, and all of this is going to be very important because we can see how things are shifting in the Middle East very dramatically, notably, of course, in Syria. What is your take on the turn of events over the past 48 hours?
Well, so there's a lot of people who have long deplored the complexity or the ickiness, if you will, of the Syrian war, because there's very few white hats and black hats, and Americans like to have purely good and purely bad actors, right? And so the fact that the anti-Assad offensive is being led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a group that has evolved somewhat, but has its roots in jihadist terrorism, gives people pause. I think the State Department's message was Assad asked for this by refusing to negotiate, but we're not very pleased about how far it's gone either. Look, personally, I think that for negotiations to happen, Assad, who's absolutely rebuffed every effort from the West for a decade, and from Turkey, most especially over the last 6 to 8 months, to negotiate some sort of an end to this war, he had to have his seat shaken. So I think all in all, from the perspective of those who want the war in Syria to stop, who want to see the killings of civilians stop and the Iranian colonization of Syria stop, I think this is in the net a good thing, even though it is messy and icky.
And after a decade of being entrenched in Syria and expanding their influence across the region, Iran does finally seem to be finding itself on the back foot, doesn't it?
Well, look, the United States and Israel both allowed, unfortunately, for a decade or more, this war by proxy against not just Israel and the United States' interests, but also the Arab peoples in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen to go uncontested because they were not fighting an open conventional war, but doing it through proxies. People just sort of let that roll, and it's been very bad and very destabilizing for the region. So, yeah, now they're wrong-footed because, led by Israel's example, I think a number of regional players have said enough, this far and no further with regards to your proxy wars. This may give a chance for diplomacy to result in a more stable and more peaceful region. Let's hope that.
Colonel Richardson, a good point to end on. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, Neri Silva, as well. Thanks to you for watching, and do stay with us on I24 News. Benita Levine is up next with the rundown. Good night.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish World Weekly. I'm Khaled Ben David, and each week we're going to bring you the latest from the Jewish world, from politics to religion, entertainment to the latest trends, and everything in between. Join me each week as we explore the global Jewish diaspora. Don't miss Jewish World Weekly only on I24 News.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are?
Introducing I24 News' brand new news website.
On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it.
So what are you waiting for? Download the I24 News app today.
urgent calls for the American and Israeli governments to do whatever it takes to help secure the release of Israeli hostages in terror captivity following the latest Hamas propaganda video showing 20-year-old hostage Idan Alexander. We go live to the Israel-Gaza border. Another early morning wake-up call for citizens across large parts of central Israel. Sirens sounding after a ballistic missile is launched from Yemen. It was successfully intercepted by air defenses. The Houthis say they were targeting Jaffa. And Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is closely monitoring what happens in Syria as thousands of Syrian rebels take over most of Aleppo city, including the airport, while facing little to no resistance from government troops. We take a deeper look at the implications. This is the rundown on I24 News. I'm Benita Levine. Israeli President Isaac Herzog has today met with family members of soldier Idan Alexander, a day after Hamas released a haunting propaganda video of the American-Israeli hostage. Idan is one of 101 hostages held in captivity in Gaza. It's still not clear how many of the hostages are alive. 422 days since the Hamas terror rampage in southern Israel on the 7th of October. The Israeli president assuring relatives that talks are happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, on the ground in Gaza, Israeli strikes continue, with two organizations saying their staff members had been killed on Saturday, and UNRWA, the UN relief agency for Palestinians, announcing it's stopping the delivery of aid through the Kerem Shalom crossing due to repeated looting of the aid by armed gangs. Senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has more in this report.
קוראים לי עידן אלכסנדר, ואני אסיר בשבי החמאס יותר מ-420. אבא, אני קרוי, סבא סבתא. כל יום שעובר, הכאב מבפנים גודל. אני מתגעגע אליכם מאוד. כל יום. אני מתפלל שאני לא אתכם שוב בקרוב. בבקשה, תשארו חזקים. זה רק עניין של זמן, עד שהסיוט הזה ייגמר.
Hamas released a new video on Saturday showing 20-year-old American-Israeli hostage Idan Alexander still being held in Gaza, calling on the Israeli and American governments to secure his release and bring him home. Saturday night, thousands of Israelis took to the street once again, calling for a ceasefire, calling for the hostages to come home. Idan's mother spoke to the crowds with a message.
So I turn to you, Prime Minister, in my name, in the name of my family, and in the name of the Israeli people. And I want you to keep your promise to me, because all eyes are on you now, waiting for you to make a courageous decision.
Sunday morning, Israeli President Isaac Herzog met with Idan's mother and stressed the immediate need to bring them all home.
The time is now. We want everyone home urgently. Now is the time to act. There are negotiations taking place behind the scenes, and it can be done. Now is the opportunity to bring about a meaningful change that will lead to a deal to free the hostages.
Meanwhile, in Gaza, the fighting continues. The IDF says it killed a member of the World Central Kitchen Organization who participated in the October 7th massacre in Israel in a strike in the southern city of Khan Yunis on Saturday. The organization released a statement saying it has paused its operations in Gaza. The international aid agency Save the Children also said one of its staff members was killed in a strike. According to the Hamas-run health ministry, at least 25 Palestinians were killed by Israeli military strikes across Gaza overnight and Saturday. In the latest push for a US-brokered ceasefire for hostages deal and to carve out a plan for the day after in Gaza, Hamas representatives arrived in Cairo Saturday for talks with Egyptian negotiators. In an interview with Israeli Army Radio Sunday morning, far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir in Israel repeated that he opposes a deal in a thinly veiled threat that his party would leave the government if it happens. Ben-Gvir also reiterated his support for settlements in Gaza, adding that the only times Israel defeated its enemies were when it took territory from them, and he added he wants to encourage immigration of Palestinians from Gaza. Despite Israel reaching a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon a few days ago, a similar deal in Gaza seems as far away as ever.
So for more, it's a pleasure to welcome to studio Yaakov Lapin, host of the podcast The Lapin Assessment on Patreon and a military and strategic affairs analyst at the Miriam Institute and the Jewish News Syndicate, and our correspondent Robert Swift. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. I want to start with your analysis in a very short while, but before we get to that, we're going to go to the latest developments on the ground, and we check in with our correspondent Zach Anders. He's in southern Israel. And Zach, chilling propaganda images, 20-year-old Israeli-American hostage Idan Alexander saying it's only a matter of time before this nightmare ends in this video. Talk us through the response so far. What is the latest on efforts to secure a deal?
Yeah, and we heard from the mother last night at the hostage rally taking place in Tel Aviv. She said she got a phone call from the prime minister after that video was released. She told the prime minister, it's time. We got to get them out. And apparently in response, according to her and what she said at the rally, she said the prime minister said that the conditions are right for a deal and that they're working towards achieving one. Now, our colleague at I-24, Guy Azriel, has just broken an element of this story, credited to him. Sources telling him that right now, as it stands, it is the August deal that was brokered or put forward by the U.S., presented once again to Hamas. Ultimately, back in August, they rejected, or there was some sort of impasse. It was reportedly rejected by Hamas. So the deal itself is the same. It has not changed as it was back in August. Of course, we did not get a deal then, but that is what Guy is hearing. He says that right now the U.S. and Israel is working on that same framework. This would be keeping troops in the Philadelphia corridor. This would be a 42-day ceasefire staggered with hostages released in intervals, and that ultimately, over the course of that 40-plus day ceasefire, it would be the all parties involved working for some negotiation to resolve the conflict in its entirety. So that's the breaking that we have this afternoon. Again, Guy at our channel, I-24, able to get some of that news for us before some of the Israeli channels. What we are also seeing on the Hamas side, they're telling the French news agency AFP that they haven't received a new offer or proposal so far. That was earlier today. We'll be curious to find out whether or not that new deal has been communicated, perhaps to the Egyptians, as they meet with this Hamas delegation. Benita?
And Zach, briefly, the latest developments in terms of fighting on the ground inside the Strip. What can you tell us? What update can you share?
Yeah, it continues to be the most heavily concentrated area in North Gaza, in Jabalia. We see a day in, day out fighting. Even while we're standing here, we were hearing gunfire earlier and saw flares light up. That area is largely ruined and wrecked. But what I'm told this morning by a senior IDF source, that the fighting that is taking place in Jabalia, very small pockets of Hamas. They're encountering 2-3 men at a time. And that this fighting, the exchanges that are taking place, it's clear they still have the ammunition, they still have the weapons, but they're operating in such a decentralized manner that there has to be only a handful of local commanders left in that area. If there is, he's describing this as complete guerrilla fighting, that they're fighting among the rubble, and they're encountering, again, very small pockets of Hamas, but still, this is the highest concentration we have of IDF fatalities in the Gaza Strip in the last 2 months. Has been tremendous losses in this area for the IDF.
Appreciate the update as always. Correspondent Zach Anders live from southern Israel, close to the Gaza border. Thank you, Zach. And our panel in studio, Yaakov Lapin, I want to pick up with you on the latest in terms of efforts to secure a deal to get all the hostages back home. We heard that update from our correspondent, Guy Azriel, updating us in terms of the framework back in August. That was a staggered release of the hostages. It doesn't necessarily mean an end to the fighting. Your take on what that development could mean to get the hostages back home?
I think the big question is whether Hamas has shown willingness or will show willingness to soften its stance, because until now, really, its stance hasn't changed at all. It's demanded an end to the war and for the IDF to leave the Gaza Strip. so that it can go ahead and take over the Gaza Strip once again with Iranian assistance. That's been its entire sort of survival strategy, and that's why it's been holding on to these hostages. Now Hamas finds itself isolated. Hezbollah is out of the war. The Iranians are worried about what may come next with the Trump administration, and Israel is increasingly confident in its capabilities. So this multi-arena strategy that Hamas was a part of is no longer really happening. It's no longer in existence as of now. And so Hamas finds itself facing the might of the IDF on its own, and it does not want to be in that situation. Now, will that translate into a change in its negotiation stance? I really hope so. I think that Israel is willing to compromise. It is willing to accept the ceasefire. It's willing to look at, various options. I don't think that it's willing to announce that it's going to leave Gaza, for years. I don't think that's on the cards. That's not on the agenda. But other things are. So we'll have to see, and we have to hope that the changes in the strategic and military situation throughout the region will have an effect primarily not on Hamas's leadership abroad. I think they're less important. It's what's left of the terrorist military leadership in Gaza. Muhammad Sinwar, the brother of Yahya, and his leadership, they're trying to, maintain some control in Gaza. They don't really have control. They don't have this centralized control over the terror cells, but they're trying to negotiate. They're trying to achieve a ceasefire. They want, obviously, Israel out of Gaza. So we'll have to see, where we end up with the negotiations. But there's reason to be a little bit optimistic that something could change.
And adding to that smidgen or glimmer of optimism, the suggestion by President Isaac Herzog that talks are happening behind the scenes. Robert, when you look at that propaganda video, when you look at the appeal from Idan Alexander, who has been in captivity for 224 days now, what do you think the impact is likely to have on these discussions to try and secure a deal right now?
I think the very fact that Hamas have chosen to release this video now demonstrates that they at least think that this will have an impact. They're clearly trying to influence the talks, both the talks themselves, but also the events going on around the talks. Clearly, the release of this video now is in response to the impending presidency of Donald Trump. I suspect that they're trying to have an influence on that, and they know that one of the, as we've just heard, they have much less levers at their disposal than they did, say, 12 months ago. One of the few remaining that they do have is the hostages, and they appear to be trying to take advantage of that right now.
And of course, time is of the essence. It's getting colder and colder. The concerns are growing, of course, for the health and safety of all the hostages. The Philadelphia corridor, it came up so many times in terms of a security deal breaker, so to speak. From your perspective, Yaakov, how big a deal is that in reaching some kind of a deal? Who needs to be maintaining what's coming in and out across that corridor?
So again, I think, short term, there's room for flexibility, but long term, I don't think, there's no doubt in my mind that Israel has got to control the Philadelphia corridor, because otherwise it's either going to be used overland as a route for the resupply of Hamas or underground. One of the strange arguments that I heard a couple of months ago when the Philadelphia corridor was in the headlines was, oh, well, most of the recent weapons smuggling occurred overground. I'm not sure what that's supposed to console anybody in Israel. At the end of the day, Israel has got to have control for a long time over the border between the Sinai and the Gaza Strip in order to prevent Hamas from rearming. This is one of the main ways that Israel will be able to do that. But in the short term, I think Israel can show flexibility to facilitate a hostage deal. I don't think that it's a deal breaker in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's absolutely critical for Israel to maintain control, not outsource it to anybody. We've been there, we've tried it. The EU has been there, the Palestinian Authority, the Egyptians, and none of them were able to prevent significant arms smuggling over or underground. I think it has got to be Israel, and that's one of the lessons from the 7th of October.
Rob, the looting of humanitarian aid continues, as we heard in that report. The UNRWA chief pausing aid deliveries through the Kerem Shalom crossing. There's talk of gangs looting that aid, not very specific. Who exactly are those gangs?
So it's understood that a lot of these are mafia or clan-based organizations. Essentially, I think you can think of the security picture in Gaza is being reduced to such a level that anybody with arms and a bit of power is exerting that strength in order to take advantage. And some of these groups are doing that for their own financial gain, or presumably for the advantage and the survival of the people under their patronage, their clan members, due to the severity of the humanitarian situation there.
Your thoughts on exactly that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Robert, and and also, there is a strategic failure here by Israel, because at the end of the day, Israel needs to follow through the military tactical success that it has achieved in the Gaza Strip on many levels, with the beginning of what I can only describe as a regime change strategy, and ultimately aimed at regime change. And that means taking control of the aid distribution process, because if Israel doesn't do that, Hamas and these gangs are going to continue to do that. There's nobody else. It's either Israel or Hamas that's going to be in charge of aid distribution, and any other idea that somebody else is going to parachute in and take control, I think at this stage, right now, I'm not saying forever, but right now that's a fantasy. And the resistance that we've had from the upper echelons of the IDF to taking over the distribution aid, I think has harmed the long-term Israeli war effort against Hamas. I think the Gazan people have got to see and understand that there's no political future for Hamas, not only no military future, but also no political future. And that is a major pressure lever, which could also help soften Hamas's position in the negotiations. So whichever which way you look at it, I think it's time for Israel to step up to this plate. It's not easy. It's not an easy decision. I understand the reluctance, but I personally don't see any way around it at this stage of the war. Otherwise, Hamas will always have a vacuum to fill, and that's not good for anybody.
The organization World Central Kitchen pausing its operations after a vehicle carrying its staff members was hit in an Israeli airstrike. Questions raised about exactly what role some of those staff members might have been having in terms of a dual role, so to speak, for want of a better way of putting it. Your take on the impact of images like that?
Well, yeah, the IDF said, it was following him, and he was a terrorist who took part in the 7th of October massacre. I think he was active in Nir Am. Obviously, this is a major screening failure by the World Central Kitchen. Their decision to stop all operations in Gaza is not necessary. They could have, investigated this and continued their activities, but they appear to be stunned by this development. Look, at the end of the day, terrorists have infiltrated multiple aid organizations. We know that UNRWA is the obvious example. I'm sure that the intentions of the World Kitchen are good, and I'm sure that their leadership wasn't aware that this was happening, so they can investigate it and resume their operations for the benefit of, the Gazan people. But at the end of the day, this is one of the things that we have to look out for, and Israel has to work with these organizations in order to prevent terrorists from infiltrating them, because, again, that's going to be negative and dangerous for everybody involved.
Dangerous indeed. Investigations obviously will continue. Stay with us, because while fighting continues in Gaza, as we've been discussing, the border between Israel and Lebanon is the quietest it's been in more than 12 months. Civilians on both sides of the frontier hoping to return to some kind of peacetime normality and routine, but many are wondering how long it will last. Correspondent Robert Swift has the details.
For now, 5 days in, the ceasefire on the Lebanon-Israel border is holding, bringing respite and a sense of normalcy to civilians in both nations, even as fighting goes on elsewhere in the region.
I welcome the ceasefire in Lebanon, and I hope it will be respected by all parties. My hope is that this opening for peace can bring a ceasefire on all fronts, especially Gaza.
Israel and Lebanon are accusing each other of breaking the ceasefire. France, one of the accord's brokers, warns that 52 alleged Israeli violations risk reigniting the fighting. The IDF says that its activity in Lebanon in recent days, including an airstrike, were to enforce the ceasefire. Many of the million-plus Lebanese displaced by the war are returning home.
I wish for the best for the country. God willing, Lebanon will come back better than it was, just as Syed Hassan Nasrallah promised us. God willing, Lebanon will be rebuilt better than it was before.
For the tens of thousands of northern Israelis forced from their homes, many are reluctant to believe the peace will hold. But others are returning to the border to see for themselves what 14 months of warfare wrought.
I see that the first line of the houses is ruined completely. It was maybe a post of the Hezbollah, and we'll see what happens in the near future.
And now for an update from the ground. We go live to correspondent Nicole Zedek. She joins us from northern Israel. So Nicole, how's the ceasefire holding up there? What is the latest?
It's a quiet day here in northern Israel and the northern Golan Heights, Benita, as we continue to see this ceasefire taking place, especially in northern Israel. But the latest update that we have is continued little skirmishes in southern Lebanon. In fact, within the past hour, the IDF giving us an update as to what happened last night. They said they saw a group of Hezbollah operatives going towards a church in southern Lebanon. And this church had been previously known to have different Hezbollah activities there. So the paratroopers brigade that was on the ground, they actually fired at these Hezbollah operatives, killing them at the scene because they said that they were engaging in this activity that violates the ceasefire. And once the paratroopers brigade then actually went into the church, scanned the area, they found a massive tunnel with weapons hidden inside as well. And so this is the activity that we're still hearing coming out of southern Lebanon, with IDF troops still operating really there along the border as they have really this 60-day period to fully withdraw. But in the meantime, they're trying to get a rein and limit any of the Hezbollah activity that continues to pop up. And they say this is all in line with the side letter they say they got from the United States that says that they have the continued ability to act in their right to self-defense and make sure that the threat from Hezbollah, specifically there along the southern border in southern Lebanon, that it's removed, allowing residents to return home. And I will say, as of last night, the IDF Homefront Command did lift some of the instructions to places in northern Israel and the northern Golan Heights, allowing students to return to classrooms today. The Education Ministry estimates roughly 150,000 students in northern Israel were actually allowed to return to their classroom. We saw videos online of them being welcomed with balloons, celebrations, really excited to get back inside the classroom. But that's not all of the students, as they only were allowed to open these schools if they could get to a shelter within time. And so many of the schools still weren't able to come home. And this is kind of the feeling that we're still hearing from some of the residents here. On the one hand, some of them are allowed to go home and they do feel safe. But on the other hand, they're seeing these tensions that are still happening in southern Lebanon. And they're wary to come back because they're just not sure exactly how long this ceasefire might stay implemented. And until they really have this assurance from the IDF, they're still staying home and not necessarily returning home quite yet. That's also if they have these homes to return to, Benita, because there's still an estimated about 400 homes that have been completely destroyed and another 500 that have suffered serious damage that need to be rebuilt as well over the course of the past 14 months. And so this relative pause is also a time to assess the damage and see what needs to be rebuilt before these northern residents can return home.
One can certainly understand the reluctance to race to get back to those homes. And as you say, so many of them still need to be rebuilt. A long road ahead. We appreciate the update. Thank you so much, correspondent Nicole Zedek, live from northern Israel. Thank you, Nicole. So Yaakov Lapin, host of the podcast, The Lapin Assessment on Patreon. Your assessment of what is happening right now. The ceasefire appears to be holding, bar those skirmishes that we heard Nicole discussing. Your take, how long is this likely to last?
I don't know how long this is likely to last, but I am very encouraged by what I see as robust, determined Israeli enforcement of any violation that they see of this ceasefire. This is what I was hoping to see going in. And I think this is what makes the difference between what we saw in the year 2000, the year 2006, and now. Those past instances when Hezbollah was allowed to reach the border and build an entire infrastructure, and in recent years that includes an invasion infrastructure with tens of thousands of anti-tank missiles and cornets. You know, that was a horrific threat that was hovering over the north, and this arsenal of rockets and missiles. This is now what they're going to try and rebuild. That's why we're seeing these skirmishes, because the IDF is enforcing the violations. Hezbollah is trying to crawl back to its positions, retake stock of its rocket arsenals, you know, trying to regroup. And these are violations of the truce, and it's the IDF that's enforcing it. This is the big change. So if this continues, I think this is good news for the North. This is not only a change in the strategic situation, a fundamental change, but also it's Israel preserving its gains, the gains that it fought so hard to achieve over the past, especially the past 2 to 3 months in Lebanon. So all in all, this is looking, I think, positive. And whether the truce holds or not, obviously we don't know. But if it doesn't, I think it's more important for the IDF to preserve these gains than to worry about the truce collapsing. That's up to Hezbollah how far it wants to push this and risk the truce collapsing or not.
And of course, Hezbollah has been showing its so-called support for Hamas in Gaza since the 8th of October, Rob. Ostensibly, now that the ceasefire is in place, tenuous as it might be, what does this mean for efforts to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, something we were talking about earlier on in the show?
It definitely improves the chances, I think. Hamas are totally isolated. They were previously relying upon the IDF being distracted by the threat from the north. That is no longer the case. It puts Iran and Hezbollah at more of a distance, and that leaves Hamas isolated. The issue, as I see it, is more that does Hamas have more of an advantage to continuing in the situation it's in currently, or does it have more of an advantage into agreeing to some sort of negotiated end to the conflict with Israel? Israel has stated that it wants to destroy Hamas, so where's the advantage to Hamas to any form of negotiated, whether they're supported by Hezbollah or not? It may well be the case that for Hamas, the best course of action is to simply continue as they are indefinitely. That will leave Israel no better off, and it will leave Israeli hostages and the population of Gaza no better off. It may, however, be Hamas's best course of action if the alternatives are worse.
We're going to take a deeper look at exactly that after the break. Gentlemen, stay with us. Right now, though, we are taking a very short break. When we get back, our coverage continues on The Rundown, and we take a deeper look at the latest developments in Syria and in Yemen. Stay tuned. This is The Rundown.
You live in Israel or you are preparing for your Aliyah? Congratulations. You have a smartphone? Perfect. Download the Olim app for free and discover everything we have to offer. Booking medical and administrative appointments, bills paying, debt verification, instant translation, contractor recommendation, request tracking, and much more. And if you can't manage it on your own, our team speaks your language and assists you with all your procedures in Israel, starting from 199 shekels per month, unlimited and for the whole family. Don't hesitate any longer. Download the app or contact us.
That doorway, I'm so pleased with the door. It looks so... I just...
Yeah, well, not summer's day, the summertime.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to The Rundown. Now, the spotlight falls on Syria, with thousands of Syrian rebels taking over most of Aleppo city, establishing positions in the country's second largest city and controlling its airport, facing little to no resistance from government troops. Throughout Saturday, Islamist insurgents continue to expand their shock offensive to the nearby province of Hama, where Syrian regime forces have regrouped to repel the advance. Now, following the huge embarrassment to President Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian leader said the country would continue to defend its stability and territorial integrity against terrorists and their supporters. Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran has the latest on the insurgents' offensive. Take a look.
Islamist rebels continue to advance in western Syria after sweeping through Aleppo, the country's second largest city. It took Syrian President Bashar al-Assad 4 years to capture Aleppo in a civil war. The rebels took it back within hours.
Allahu Akbar. أرتال الثوار تدخل مدينة حلب بالمئات. Allahu Akbar.
After seizing most of the city with little to no resistance from government troops, rebel forces toppled the statue of Assad's brother, Basil, in scenes reminiscent of last decade's Arab Spring. Rebel forces then continued south, gaining control over dozens of towns and villages on their way to the city of Hama. After seizing the Aleppo International Airport, insurgents led by Hayat Tahrir al-Shem, a former al-Qaeda affiliate, took over the Queiris military airport, along with all its fighter jets, weapons, and ammunition. After absorbing the initial shock of the surprise offensive, regime forces appear to have regrouped and are repelling rebel advances in Hama province. In phone calls with Arab leaders, President Assad said Syria will defend its stability and territorial integrity against terrorists and their supporters. Iran and Russia vowed to continue supporting Assad as Russian jets bombarded civilian areas of Idlib and Aleppo.
We see that after the ceasefire between Lebanon and the Zionist regime, terrorist groups in Syria have tried to take advantage of the situation. God willing, the resistance front and the Syrian government will be victorious, and they will not be able to achieve their goals.
With the initial momentum of the rebels largely halted, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq have begun flowing into Syria to help defend Assad's hold, in what seems to be a long-awaited restart of the Syrian civil war.
And joining our panel, human rights lawyer Arsen Ostrovsky, attorney and CEO at International Legal Forum and senior fellow at the Misgov Institute. And still with us, Yaakov Lapin, host of the podcast The Lapin Assessment on Patreon, and a military and strategic affairs analyst at the Miriam Institute and the Jewish News Syndicate, and our correspondent Robert Swift. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'm going to start straight away, Yaakov, with the surprise developments in Syria, rebels capturing most of Aleppo, a huge embarrassment for Bashar al-Assad. But from Israel's perspective, watching through the prism of developments across that front, what does it all mean?
Well, first of all, it appears to be a knock-on effect, a domino effect from events in Lebanon. I think the rebels were looking at this Iranian Shiite axis, their top enemy, and they see that it is weakened. They see that Hezbollah cannot come to the aid of the Assad regime. They see that Russia is bogged down on the Ukrainian front in Eastern Europe. And what does that leave? That leaves them with the Shiite militias in Iraq and Iran itself, which I'm sure will try to scramble to help as much as they can. But now Israel is in a much stronger position. By the way, we had a report in recent minutes from Yediot Achronot saying that the Israeli Air Force yesterday forced an Iranian cargo plane that was trying to land in Syria, forced it to turn back. So we're seeing Israel enforce not just the situation in Lebanon, but also in Syria. And I think the rebels here sensed an opportunity. Turkey is also involved here as well. Turkey has its own agenda. It wants to send back 3 to 4 million Syrian refugees that have settled in Turkey. They want them out. So, you know, there's a lot going on here. But at the end of the day, I think if we're looking at the short-term situation, there is an advantage here for Israel, because anything that breaks the top threat, the most capable threat, in my view, is the Iranian Shiite threat. That's the biggest threat to our security. And when you add the Iranian nuclear program, that's also becomes an existential threat. So anything that weakens that threat in the short term is a gain. But we also have to keep a very wary eye about some of the actors that are involved here in Syria. Some of them are former al-Qaeda branches. Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham is a former al-Qaeda branch. And so obviously, we have to keep a close eye, especially when they start moving towards some of these very sensitive facilities in Syria that were used to produce accurate missiles and chemical weapons, especially the chemical weapons. I don't think Israel is going to want to see them get their hands on that. But at the end of the day, these rebels are very focused on Syria. They're interested in Syria. They're also trying to message Israel through the Israeli media. It's remarkable. You're seeing, Islamist rebels that, a few years ago were allied with al-Qaeda, then they broke with al-Qaeda, now telling Israel, don't worry, we have no problems with you. Our problem is with your enemies, with the Assad regime and Hezbollah. This is the Middle East. It's very chaotic. I think in the short term there are opportunities for Israel, but we have to be wary, and we can't be jubilant either.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu himself weighing in just a short while ago. Let's take a listen in his own words.
We are constantly following what is happening in Syria. We are also determined to protect the vital interests of the State of Israel and to preserve the achievements of the war.
Arsen Ostrovsky, you're hearing Benjamin Netanyahu speaking about these developments. They've been happening over a period of days. Your thoughts?
Look, I'd just say two things here. One, I don't have any great love for either side. It may well be the case that my enemy's enemy is still my enemy. But obviously, the concern is from Israel's perspective, and what Yaakov said, I think, is very true. I'm also, the other thing I'd say is, in terms of timing, we know that they're doing what they're doing primarily and precisely because we have managed to decimate Hezbollah and really to weaken Iran. But it's also the international perspective that's interesting. You're not really not seeing any international response. There's no UN resolutions. There's no encampments. There's no university protests. There's no calls for calm and restraint or two-state solution for Syria, anything like that. So it's really, the sort of the level of hypocrisy when it comes to conflicts related to Israel and Gaza and then elsewhere in the world, certainly in the region, is quite shining.
We wait to hear the outrage from the international community. Rob, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi meeting President Bashar al-Assad to discuss the situation. We've seen the photographs of that meeting, the concerns out of what they might be discussing as we speak.
First of all, Iran clearly will want to shore up the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But I think, as we've been hearing, there's a limit to what Iran can do. Its plate is pretty full already dealing with Israel. And so the scenarios that played out in the previous decade, in the earlier stages of the Syrian civil war, it's not clear at all that they will repeat in the same manner, especially because Russia is out of the picture. Now, there have been some airstrikes conducted by the Russian Air Force, but on a much smaller scale. In the past, Russia acted as the main branch of the Syrian Air Force, and Iran provided a lot of the foot troops on the ground. It's not clear if either will be able to pick up this weight in the same manner. That being said, I think Iraq is the main direction to look at. Iran has a lot of influence over the Shiite organizations based out of Iraq. Some of these units appear to have been mobilized. That will likely be one of the main ways that Iran looks to support them. One other thing I'd say is that the speed of this offense coming out of the blue, it reminds us quite a lot of the ISIS sweep into Iraq a decade ago. That was countered in large part by Shiite militias in Iraq, those same militias that are now appearing to deploy into Syria to counter the rebel offensive.
A powerful Iraqi faction has vowed to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. We wait to see how it all unfolds. As you said earlier, the dynamics are interesting. We wait to see how it all develops. Gentlemen, stay with us. We've got much more to discuss as we turn our focus to the UK now. Oxford University and the chaos which unfolded over the weekend during a debate asking whether Israel is responsible for genocide. Now, security was tight. Hundreds of protesters gathering outside as prominent pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian speakers tackled the issues. Oxford Union voting 278 to 59 in favour of the proposition that Israel is an apartheid state that is committing genocide. The debate devolved into a shouting match between the speakers and the audience, and one of the speakers, Israeli Arab activist Yosef Haddad, was removed from the stage. Now, UK correspondent Jonathan Sachadoti was one of the speakers at Oxford University, and he joins us now live from London. Jonathan, good to see you. Oxford is a bastion of free speech, or perhaps not, it seems. Astounding scenes playing out at the debate, no shortage of insults. Talk us through what happened.
I was booked to speak at that debate a while ago, and there were a few changes in the lineup. At one point, one or two of the speakers pulled out, as I suppose is normal in these sorts of things. But we knew that things weren't going to be good as soon as we tried to help them book replacements. So one speaker pulled out at quite short notice, which is when I suggested that we should reach out to Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of a Hamas founder who had then spent 10 years informing on Hamas to the Israeli authorities to save lives and prevent suicide bombings. The union told me that they would invite him, I suppose agreeing that he would be a fantastic guest for them to have on our side of the debate. But of course, I was in conversation with him as well and found out that they never approached him. So in the end, we did manage to get them to book him, but that level of deception carried on throughout the preparations. And when we did arrive on the night in the chamber of that august debating society, meant to be a bastion of free speech, many prime ministers and leading members of parliament have made their way through the Oxford Union. We were faced by a hideous crowd, baying mob, who really weren't even there to give us a fair hearing. They were laughing, coughing, jeering, swearing at us in Arabic, cursing us all the way through from the word go. It was very clear that this wasn't an exercise in debate or free speech, but it was an exercise in trying to put on some kind of show trial of Israel.
And you mentioned Mossab Hassan Youssef, the author, of course, of The Son of Hamas. He took to social media following the debate, accusing the Oxford Union of being controlled by terrorist supporters. So what has the response been since the debate? Tell us more.
Well, plenty of people have been shocked with what unfolded, and what Mossab referred to there was interesting because it's not just hyperbole. He actually decided, knowing that we'd lose the vote, the actual vote where they leave at the end through a door of yes or no, whether they agree or don't agree, because they packed the room. It was a ticketed event. They'd hand-picked who would be there. They packed the room with people who were against us from the start. I saw about 4 Jews in the room, for example, sitting nervously at the back together. Many Jews had told me they couldn't or wouldn't attend out of fear. Now, that in itself should have been worrying for the organisers. But what Mossab did was he asked the crowd, having told them that he had saved lives by informing on Hamas, his father's own terrorist organisation, of which he was a part, he asked them how many of them in the audience would have given information to the authorities if they'd had it ahead of the 7th of October attacks, i.e. helped to prevent them. Only a few people put up their hands. I was one of them, but I don't think that was the point. So I think he demonstrated with that they really were supporting terrorism, because who wouldn't in their right mind, if they knew about the terror attacks, the massacres, the brutality of the 7th of October, who wouldn't report it? And those people in that room wouldn't have been in a fraction of the danger that he was, having done that with his own life. So I think he demonstrated it rather than asserted it.
Staggering indeed. Very briefly, would you take part in another forum like that again?
Listen, I will take part in any event where I think that people can hear what I've got to say. I don't think it was a fair hearing, but I did get to say what I wanted, and hopefully they will release the videos of it so that more people around the world will at least get to hear the arguments.
Yes, hoping. Thank you, as always, UK correspondent Jonathan Sachadoti, live from London. Thanks, Jonathan. And who better than human rights lawyer Arsen Ostrowski to weigh in on exactly that? This is unconscionable.
Not sure what else can be said that already hasn't been said. Oxford University, the Oxford Debating Society, is meant to be, an august organisation, a bastion of free speech, democracy, enlightened thought, but it was hijacked by jihadists, quite simply. I still think it was the right thing to do, to go there, to debate, because I don't think they were necessarily debating their opponents or those in the crowd, those that were cheering, essentially, for the murderers, butchers and rapists of Hamas, but for everyone else that was watching them, and to expose those people that do reject Israel's right to exist, that do cheer on the crimes of groups like Hamas under the guise of some kind of enlightened thought of free speech. So I think they were right to do it, and I certainly applaud them for doing so.
Unbelievable to think that this is the level of debate, how things descend into chaos at an institution like Oxford. You've just come back, Arsene, from Canada, addressing the Canadian Parliament. Concerns, of course, about anti-Semitism, the uptick around the globe since the 7th of October. Tell us more.
You know, it was a surreal experience. As I was actually packing to go to Canada, my wife had asked me, are you going to have security? And I thought for a second, you know, what is she talking about? I'm literally flying in from a war zone, but at the same time I was as if flying into another war zone. And I was there in Montreal during those riots, and they were just harrowing. It was, you know, it's hard not to draw parallels to what happened in Amsterdam. Right. And when I spoke to leaders there from all levels of the political echelon, I told them unless corrective action is taken, there will be a repeat on the streets of Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, what happened in Amsterdam. The community is under assault. I spoke to students, they're scared. They're incredibly brave and courageous for standing up, but they're scared. The Jewish community feels abandoned. It's as if, you know, enough promises from the government, you know, it's nice to condemn anti-Semitism. It's nice to say that it's not part of our society, but it's so entrenched into the society there, and the government is not acting. At one point, I was speaking at the Toronto City Council, and I asked them, how can the police not act when you hear these protests and calls for globalized intifada? And they said to me, well, it depends on intent. And that really harks back to what we saw, if you remember, with the congressional hearings when Elise Stefanik, soon-to-be American ambassador to the UN, grilled the heads of top universities.
Diabolical, what happened there.
Yeah, genocide depends on context, and it's the same situation here. So I think the community is fed up. They feel abandoned by the government. Israel feels abandoned by the government, and quite frankly, it feels like Canada has abandoned their own values.
Well, Justin Trudeau was meeting with Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. One wonders if that featured in their discussions. But it brings me to my next point, and that is what the Trump administration could mean for the fight against anti-Semitism. We're talking about Oxford, we're talking about Canada, Amsterdam, and of course US campuses as well. Your sense of what things could look like post the 20th of January in terms of having Jews in America feel safe?
Look, I'm cautiously optimistic in knowing that there is a sense of unpredictability in terms of what will happen, but we certainly need to judge in terms of you know, what we have, and that includes the people that have been appointed to high-level cabinet positions, and they're all incredibly staunch friends and allies, supporters of Israel, who have been unwavering in speaking out against anti-Semitism. And we have to look at also what the president himself, or president-elect, has said. You know, one of his first statements in the days after the election, they said that they will take accreditation away and take funding away from those universities that receive federal funding but yet continue to not only engage in anti-Semitism but refuse to take action. So I think there will be positive steps in terms of not just on campuses but elsewhere and in the international arena, which is so critical as well, including at the UN and elsewhere. So time will tell, but I think the initial steps are quite positive.
Including at the UN, such a good point. Indeed. Stay with us. Much more to discuss as we come back to developments here on the ground. It was another early morning wake-up call for citizens across large parts of central Israel today. Sirens sounding after a ballistic missile was launched from Yemen. It was successfully intercepted by air defenses outside Israel's borders, but shrapnel from the interception fell within Israel. There were no reports of major damage. 4 people likely injured as they ran to shelters. The Iranian-backed Houthis claiming responsibility. Spokesman Yahya Saraya saying they were targeting Jaffa. Take a listen.
The missile force of the Yemeni Houthi armed forces, by Almighty Allah's support, carried out an operation against a vital target in the occupied Jaffa with a hypersonic missile, type Palestine 2. The missile has successfully hit its target by Allah's grace. The Yemeni Houthi armed forces, in light of the continued crimes of the enemy in the Gaza Strip, will double its military operations with missiles and drones as part of its religious, moral and humanitarian duty in support of and assistance to the Mujahideen in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The operations of the Yemeni Houthi armed forces will not stop until the aggression on the Gaza Strip is halted and the siege is lifted.
Yaakov Lapin still in studio. That surface-to-surface missile shot down with the Arrow defense system at a high altitude. It may be quiet across the front with Lebanon, but the Houthis are still active.
They are still active. You know, there's a couple of ways to look at this. I mean, I was woken up with my family at around 6:30 in the morning by this siren. But really, you know, I don't think the Houthis will be glad to know that Israeli society today is resilient. This is not what's going to shut down our society. We know how to deal with these sirens. Yes, they are certainly, you know, not something we want to live with. But this is not what's going to break the spirit of Israeli society. And the Houthis should be well aware of that. The claim that this is a hypersonic missile is ridiculous. This looks like a standard ballistic surface-to-surface missile. The Arrow 3 has proven itself as a defense system that can take on not only the occasional Houthi missile, but also, you know, a barrage, some of the biggest barrages in the history of warfare that the Iranians fired directly at Israel. So the Arrow 3 is an absolutely wonderful and advanced system, the most advanced of its kind. It's continuing to defend us. I think largely, you know, if we zoom out a little bit, the fact that the Houthis have been able to not only continue to do this, but also to shut down maritime traffic in the Red Sea, which is a challenge to the whole world order, and all they've gotten from the West is the occasional strike, I think is frankly a stain on the determination of the United States and its allies to enforce their order against a challenge not only to Israel. This is also a challenge to the economies of Jordan, of Egypt, of all of the ships that have to travel around the Horn of Africa instead of going through the Suez Canal. This is a challenge to the whole civilized you know, world order, and very little has been done about it. Israel has been the primary force striking the Houthis as it fights this multi-front war. A lot more has to be done against the Houthis, but they're certainly not going to be the ones who will break our spirit here.
No doubt about that. Stay with us as we turn our attention to security developments in the West Bank now. The latest developments there. The IDF confirming today that a drone strike targeted terrorists in the Jenin area of the northern West Bank. The terrorists were under surveillance at the time. The IDF also mapping out the home of a terrorist who opened fire at the Gitai Avisar junction in the West Bank on Friday, in which at least 9 Israelis were wounded. The terrorist was killed at the scene. His home will be demolished in accordance with Israeli policy. Robert Swift, our correspondent, monitoring all developments there. Much on the go in the West Bank. The IDF and Shin Bet eliminating a terrorist who had murdered Israeli citizen Yonatan Deutsch. That was back in August in the Jordan Valley. Tell us more.
That's right. There was a shooting attack that took place there, killing Yonatan and wounding 1 other Israeli. Now, the Israeli security services say that subsequent to that event, Wael Lalu, who was the target of the strike, he had recruited additional fighters and conducted a number of additional shooting attacks. The IDF sent troops in after the strike, seized 3 weapons and the bodies of those killed.
Very briefly, Yaakov, your concerns about things boiling over, so to speak, in the West Bank as we speak.
This is actually now, in many ways, the top threat because, you know, Hezbollah is out of the fight for a while, and Hamas has been, you know, dismantled as an organized terror force. It poses a threat to the IDF in Gaza, but not much more than that. But terrorists in the West Bank are now actually the primary immediate threat to the Israeli home front and to Israelis living in Judea and Samaria. It's the threat of the gunman. It's the threat of the bomber that attempts to evade Israeli intelligence. Even though most of these plots are thwarted, this is the most immediate threat. It's a threat that we've lived with for many years. And unfortunately, it's going to continue to accompany us, and we're going to have to be very vigilant. In my view, it's the most it has moved up now because the other arenas are now falling under control. It has moved up to being the most imminent threat to our security is terrorism from the West Bank.
Concerning indeed. And I want to circle back to our top story. We started the show, Arsen, talking about the hostage deal. There is a poll on Channel 12 News, and it says 71% of Israelis back a hostage deal to end the war. We saw that heartbreaking video, that propaganda video, another Hamas video of Eden Alexander. Your thoughts about efforts to get the hostages back home, how it's perceived here at home and how it's perceived abroad?
Look, I'm surprised that 100% of the population is not eager to see a hostage deal. I think everyone wants the war to end and hostages to return. The question is, what kind of deal? In what circumstances? I think, as we saw in the video with Eden, time is really, it's running out. We're in winter now. It's cold, it's brutal, it's wet. For those that are living in the dungeons, it's the most unbearable of circumstances, of conditions. And we need to remember, this war will not be over, until the hostages are back. We have decimated essentially Hamas as a fighting force, but this will not end until the hostages, all 101 of them, return home.
The Red Cross has yet to get to see any of the hostages in all this time. As you say, concerns about winter, concerns about the health of the hostages, ranging in age from a baby to people in their 80s. Your parting thoughts, Yaakov, on what it's going to take to get the hostages back home as soon as possible, briefly.
As I was saying earlier, I hope that there is some sort of change in the negotiation position of Hamas, that they see that they're on their own, they see that the IDF is going to apply growing amounts of pressure and resources on them as they free up from other arenas, and hopefully they will understand that they will have to change their negotiations if they want to see a deal. And if that happens, then I think that Israel will meet them halfway and we'll see a breakthrough. It's something that we can certainly hope for.
Certainly, the nation is hoping. Day 422 of the war. Yaakov Lapin, Arsen Ostrowski, Robert Swift, appreciate you being here on The Rundown. Thank you very much for being here in studio. And with that, we wrap up this edition of The Rundown. Back again tomorrow, same time, same place. I'm Vanessa Levine, live in Tel Aviv. Thank you for watching.